Rhett Calloway only came to the Brooks Meridian Tower to fix a jammed elevator before a shareholder gala. He wore a worn canvas jacket, grease still dark under his fingernails, and behind him walked his 8-year-old daughter, Lydia, cradling a small handmade birthday cake she had baked for him that morning. CEO Delaney Brooks looked him over from shoes to collar and spoke in a voice that carried across the marble lobby. "No woman would marry you." Rhett said nothing. He only bent down and picked up the birthday candle Lydia had dropped. 3 days later, Delaney stood in the rain outside his apartment door, voice trembling, asking him for one date. Stay close, because those 3 days will show exactly why Delaney would come to regret insulting the most decent man in the room. The Brooks Meridian Tower rose 48 floors above the Chicago River, its glass skin catching every shade of late afternoon light. And on the evening of the shareholder gala, it was dressed in the kind of quiet perfection that cost more per hour than most people earned in a month. Inside, the catering staff moved in synchronized choreography. Florists adjusted arrangements that cost more than tuition, and Delaney Brooks stood at the center of it all, with a patience so thin it was nearly transparent, running through the evening's timeline the way a surgeon reviews a procedure she cannot afford to lose. The gala was the capstone of a 14-month acquisition campaign, a real estate portfolio worth $3.2 billion, and every institutional investor who would determine whether Brooks Meridian cleared that mountain or stumbled at its base was expected through the lobby doors within the hour. Delaney had not slept more than 4 hours in the previous 3 nights, had not eaten a full meal since Tuesday, and had spent the morning in a conference call with bond underwriters who asked the same question 7 different ways because they did not like the only answer she had. She was, in every practical sense, a woman hanging from a ledge by the tips of her fingers, which was precisely why the call that came at 4:53 in the afternoon, reporting that the VIP elevator had jammed between the 47th and 48th floors, landed in her chest like a stone dropped from a height. The building's facilities coordinator patched the work order through to Rhett Calloway, whose contract covered mechanical and elevator systems for 3 mid-rise and high-rise properties in the River North Corridor, including the Brooks Meridian Tower, and Rhett arrived 20 minutes later with a canvas tool bag slung over his shoulder, the kind of jacket that had been dark navy once, but had been washed so many times. It had reached a color that existed somewhere between memory and fact, and behind him, small hand wrapped around the strap of her backpack, walked Lydia. Lydia was 8 years old, patient in the way children raised by thoughtful parents learn to be patient, and she carried a white box, not from a bakery, but handmade at 5 in the morning in their narrow apartment kitchen, because it was her father's 39th birthday, and she had been planning his cake for 11 days. No one had been available to watch her that afternoon. The neighbor who usually helped had gone to a family matter in Wisconsin, and Rhett had called 3 backup options before accepting that his daughter would simply have to come along. She sat in one of the lobby chairs with the box on her knees, and her ankles crossed the way she had been taught, watching the ceiling with the mild curiosity of a child who found everything at least a little interesting. Whitney Boone, the communications director, was the first person of consequence to notice them, and her reaction arrived in the form of a lowered voice aimed at Delaney's left ear. Something about image, something about the distinction between a luxury event and a maintenance call, and Delaney absorbed the remark without registering it fully because she was already looking at Rhett, with a judgment so fast and so complete that she never noticed she had made it. She saw the jacket, saw the grease still sitting at the base of his thumbnail, saw the little girl with the homemade box, and assembled from those 3 pieces a portrait of a man who had not found a way to organize his life, a man carrying obligations he had not asked for, a man who represented every kind of disorder she had spent her adult career building walls against. Rhett, for his part, did not look at Delaney at all. He went directly to the elevator panel, opened it with the practiced economy of someone who had done the same thing several hundred times, and began his assessment. He worked quietly, without narrating his process or inflating the seriousness of what he was doing. And within 8 minutes, he had identified the origin of the problem. Not a mechanical failure, not a worn cable or a seized pulley, but a software-level interruption in the elevator's operating system. Something that looked at first like a random error, but carried the particular signature of a deliberate command. He cross-checked the timestamp against the building's access log, and the picture became clearer. Someone with elevated system credentials had initiated the interruption remotely. He wrote this down on a single page from his field notebook in the clean, compressed notation of an engineer who had learned to say the important thing first and stop. Before he could do anything further, Lydia shifted in her chair and the bakery box tilted, and the single birthday candle Rhett had set aside on the seat beside her slid off the armrest and bounced once on the marble floor. Whitney Boone made a small sound, barely a laugh at all, more like the verbal form of a turned shoulder, and she said something about the difference between a birthday party and a professional venue, and several of the nearby staff members made the choice to find their shoes very interesting at that moment. Rhett picked up the candle, wiped it on the clean edge of his sleeve, and handed it back to Lydia without a word. Delaney, standing 6 feet away, felt the frustration of the day collect behind her sternum and release in a single sentence she did not weigh before speaking, "No woman would marry you." The lobby went quiet in the way that lobbies go quiet when everyone hears the thing that cannot be unsaid and begins immediately calculating how far away from it they can position themselves. Lydia's chin went up a fraction and then down, and her eyes did the thing that children's eyes do in the moment, before they decide whether to cry. Rhett stood up to his full height and looked at Delaney with an expression that was not angry, not wounded, not pleading, but simply present. The look of a man who had been measured incorrectly so many times that he had long since stopped needing the measurement to be right. He said, evenly and without theater, "Maybe you're right, but my daughter doesn't need a father you approve of." He turned back to the elevator panel and resumed working. The elevator was restored to full function in 11 minutes. Other technicians, Delaney knew from experience, would have taken 40 to 60 minutes on the same job. Rhett completed the task without marking his pace with any visible effort, the way experts always make the hardest things look like the most natural ones. He packed his bag, signed the digital work order on his phone, and before he left, he placed a single folded page on the reception desk. His field note, the one describing the software anomaly, the access timestamp, the evidence that the failure was not accidental, and addressed it to the facilities manager with a brief note in the margin suggesting that the building's IT security team be consulted before the evening's event. Delaney saw him leave the note. She picked it up, read the first 2 lines, and set it back down with the flat certainty of a woman who had already decided what kind of man she was dealing with. She assumed he was padding a work report, inflating a minor glitch into a crisis to extend the contract. She did not read the rest. Cassidy Monroe picked up the note. Cassidy had been Delaney's personal assistant for 4 years, and in that time she had learned to treat Delaney's dismissals as data rather than conclusions, to note what her employer waved away, and then decide quietly for herself what it was worth. The technical notation in Rhett's handwriting was not what she expected from a contract maintenance worker. The symbols were precise. The architecture of the argument was compressed but internally consistent, and the language used to describe the access pattern belonged to a vocabulary she associated with systems engineers who had spent years at the level where the theoretical met the structural. She folded the note and put it in her jacket pocket. On the way down in the service elevator, Rhett asked Lydia what she wanted to eat. She said pasta with the sauce from the jar, which he had been pretending for 3 years was his own recipe, and he said that sounded like the best idea he had heard all day. She asked, with the careful seriousness of a child who wants to understand a thing rather than avoid it, whether it made him sad when someone said something mean in front of other people. He told her that people carrying a lot of old pain sometimes let it fall on whoever happened to be standing nearest, and that this did not obligate the person who had been hit to carry it, and it did not mean anything about who they were. Lydia nodded in the way she nodded when she was storing something for later, and they walked to the bus stop with the bakery box held between them. The gala proceeded on schedule. The investors arrived in their black cars, the champagne poured cold and pale, and Delaney moved through the room with the controlled elegance that had taken her a decade to make look effortless. But the field note was not entirely out of her mind. She was not thinking about Rhett. She told herself she was not thinking about Rhett, but she could not stop replaying the specific quality of his silence after she had spoken. She had insulted men before. She had watched them harden or grovel or deflect into a joke. Rhett had done none of those things. He had looked at her as though she were a weather condition, something to be noted and prepared for, not something that had any jurisdiction over the work he was there to do. An hour into the gala, the main display screens flickered, held, flickered again, and displayed a cascade of error messages across 6 feet of high-definition glass before the IT team killed the power to the system and rebooted from backup. Cassidy stood in the back of the room with her hand in her jacket pocket and said nothing to anyone. The IT department's official finding used the phrase isolated software anomaly in the way that official findings use words when the goal is precision without alarm. No external breach. Event concluded successfully. Investors satisfied. Brooks Meridian was, by every conventional measure, having a very good evening. But Delaney sat in her office on the 44th floor after the caterers left and read Rhett's note again with the whole document in front of her this time, and she understood enough of what it said to know that the IT department's explanation and Rhett's field observation were not describing the same event. Rhett had named the error before it happened. He had recorded the access timestamp, identified the credential tier that had been used, and described the likely behavioral effect with the kind of specificity that random anomalies do not produce. Cassidy came into the office and sat across from Delaney without waiting to be invited, which was something she had earned the right to do after the 3rd year. She told Delaney what she had been holding, her own read of the note, the anomaly in Rhett's employment history, specifically the 7 years before his current contracting work, during which his professional record was nearly blank, as though someone had removed it or it had never been filed in the first place. Delaney listened, and although she did not like receiving evidence that suggested she had made an error of assessment, she was not the kind of executive who survived by refusing evidence. She told Cassidy to run a full background search and have results by morning. What the morning search produced was sparse in the way that deliberate sparseness is different from genuine emptiness. Rhett Calloway, 39, held a current contractor's license in 3 states, maintained a single bank account at a regional credit union, lived in a 2-bedroom rental in Wicker Park, and had primary custody of 1 child following the death of his wife Tessa 4 years prior. The surface record was unremarkable. But before that, before the contracting work, before the license renewals, before Tessa's death, there was almost nothing in any searchable database, and the absence had the particular shape of a record that had been scrubbed rather than one that had never existed. Delaney looked at the printout for a long time, and then she did something she rarely did. She picked up her own phone and placed a call. She contacted the facility's coordinator and asked for Rhett to be reached for a follow-up security assessment. The coordinator returned her call 40 minutes later to say that Rhett had declined, stating that his work order for the property had been fulfilled and his schedule was currently committed to other sites. Whitney, who happened to be standing in the office when this was relayed, made a sound that expressed a whole opinion without requiring words, and then added that contractors in his position should recognize that a call from a CEO represented a different category of opportunity than they were likely to encounter elsewhere. Delaney, who would normally have agreed, felt the remark land differently than she expected. She told Whitney she would handle it herself and closed the door. The reason she did not handle it that day was that her operations team surfaced something else by late afternoon. A vendor contract signed 41 days earlier by Garrett Holloway. Her VP of operations, a man she had trusted with the mechanical infrastructure of the property, with a facilities company she did not recognize. The company's filings pointed to a holding entity. The holding entity pointed to a shell registered in Nevada. The shell had been incorporated 11 months ago, and the vendor held active access credentials to the Brooks Meridian Towers building management system. Delaney sat with this for a long time and realized that the man she had dismissed as a technician trying to inflate his importance had described a genuine threat before she had the information to understand it. Delaney went to Wicker Park the next morning without telling anyone except Cassidy, who drove. The neighborhood was nothing like River North. Narrower sidewalks, older brick, coffee shops that did not require a reservation, trees with roots that had lifted sections of the pavement into gentle ridges. The building where Rhett lived was a 4-story walk-up with a buzzer panel where 3 of the name slots had been replaced by handwritten tape labels, and the hallway inside smelled of old wood and the particular domestic warmth of multiple lives being lived close together. Outside the door of apartment 212 there were 3 small clay pots with herbs growing in them. Basil, something with purple edges, a third plant Delaney did not recognize, and beside them a hand-painted wooden sign in a child's lettering that read, Callaway's. Delaney stood in front of that sign for a moment longer than she intended. She had come prepared with an offer, 3 times his standard rate, framed as an emergency consultation for building security. She had the number ready, the terms structured, the logic airtight. She knocked, and what she heard behind the door before it opened was not what she had prepared for. An older woman's voice, a creaking floorboard, a child's laugh abruptly quieted. When the door did open, what she saw through it was a narrow hallway and, past it, visible through the kitchen doorway, Rhett himself on the floor beside a baseboard heater with a wrench in his hand, a woman in her late 70s standing nearby wringing a dish towel, and Lydia sitting on the kitchen counter narrating something with great enthusiasm. Delaney watched for 3 seconds before anyone noticed her. The older woman was thanking Rhett with the specific, unhurried warmth of someone who meant it entirely. He said something that made Lydia laugh again. When he stood and turned and saw Delaney in the doorway, his expression did not shift into surprise or calculation. He simply wiped his hands on a rag and waited. He escorted the neighbor, without consistent heat for 6 days because management had not responded to her 3rd maintenance request, back down the hall, and when he returned, he did not invite Delaney inside but did not close the door, which she took as permission to remain. She made her offer, framing it as a professional engagement, keeping the personal dimension out of her voice with the precision of someone who had practiced emotional containment until it became structural. Rhett listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said that the number was not the issue. He said that his daughter had cried when she got home from the tower 2 days ago. Not loudly, but in the quiet way that children cry when they are trying not to cause a problem. And he did not return to environments where that kind of thing had happened without an acknowledgement of why it happened. Delaney started to say that she hadn't targeted Lydia. What came out instead was, I didn't mean it as something directed at her. Rhett looked at her and said, "But you said it in front of her." The hallway was very quiet, and Delaney was not a woman who regularly found herself without a prepared response, and the experience of standing without one was uncomfortable in a specific, accurate way she had not felt in years. Lydia appeared at Rhett's elbow a moment later with a glass of water held in both hands, the way a child offers something when they have been taught that guests in the home are always offered water because it is respectful and it costs nothing. Delaney took the glass. She said thank you in a voice that was not quite steady, and Lydia nodded with the serene good manners of a child who had not been shown how to hold a grudge. When Delaney set down the empty glass and asked, quietly, whether there was any version of his helping that did not require her to have already been a different person, Rhett thought for a moment and then said he would look at whatever data Cassidy was prepared to share, because if there was a genuine threat to the building, it was not fair for the people who worked in it to bear the consequences of whatever was happening between him and her. He said he would look at the data, and he did not say anything else. Cassidy brought the data files to Rhett's apartment kitchen table the following morning. Access logs, event timestamps, a compressed archive of the building management system's behavioral history for the past 90 days, and the vendor contract Delaney had recovered from Garrett's files. Rhett opened them on his laptop, asked for a cup of coffee that he did not drink, and worked through the material in the systematic, accelerating way of someone who already knows what they are looking for and is simply confirming it. Delaney sat across the table and watched, and she had sat across from many analysts and engineers over the course of her career, and had learned to read the difference between someone performing competence and someone who had internalized it so completely that it had stopped being a performance. Rhett fell entirely into the second category. He did not narrate his process. He did not look up to check whether she was impressed. He worked. In 22 minutes, he had built a complete picture of what Garrett's vendor had done and what it planned to do next. The intervention was not designed for catastrophe, no structural failures, no physical danger, but for precisely calibrated operational chaos. Elevators halted between floors, the VIP corridor locked, the main display system frozen at the opening of the shareholder presentation, the audio cycling through error states. Each of these, individually, was a recoverable inconvenience. Together, timed to the opening minutes of the board presentation, they would create the impression of a CEO who could not manage her own building on the most important afternoon of the quarter. That impression, Rhett explained, pointing to the cascade logic in the code, would be sufficient given the existing restlessness among two of the board's institutional members to trigger a confidence vote. Garrett did not need Delaney to fail at the acquisition. He needed her to look like she had failed to keep the lights on. Delaney absorbed this with the stillness of someone receiving information they had suspected but had not wanted to formalize. She asked how Rhett understood the political dimension of what he was describing, and he said that systems that fail on cue tell you something about who controls the timing. She looked at him for a long moment and then asked where he had learned to read it this way, and he gave the answer he had been giving in various forms for years. That he had worked in building systems long enough to understand how they could be made to lie. Cassidy had left a printed page at the corner of the table, a brief mention in a technology journal from 11 years earlier, a list of Regional Engineering Award nominees, and a name, R. Callaway, founder, Callaway Urban Systems, cited for innovations in integrated safety architecture for high-density urban structures. Rhett saw it. He glanced at Cassidy and then at Delaney and said, without being asked, that he had started a company with his wife Tessa when he was 30, that they had designed systems meant to make tall buildings survivable rather than merely tall, and that when Tessa got sick he had changed his priorities, and when she died he had changed them completely. He said Lydia had needed a father, and he had chosen to be one. He did not frame this as a sacrifice. He said it the way people state the things they have already finished, being uncertain about. Delaney said nothing for a moment, and then she turned to Lydia, who had been drawing at the far end of the table with headphones on, and said, directly and without preamble, that she was sorry for what she had said in the lobby 2 days ago. She said she had been frightened about something entirely unrelated to Lydia and had let it out in a direction it had no business going, and that was on her and no one else. Lydia pulled off one side of the headphones and looked at her with the clear, uncluttered appraisal of a child who has not yet learned to be skeptical of sincerity, and said, "Okay. Do you want to see what I drew?" Delaney said yes, and meant it entirely. Rhett watched from across the table, and the faint alteration in the set of his shoulders suggested that what he had just seen, a genuine apology offered to a child without performing it for the adult present, had registered in a way that the apology to him had not yet been able to. The emergency board session was set for the following afternoon, the third day since the lobby. Garrett had been maneuvering toward this moment for months, had cultivated 2 institutional shareholders whose impatience with Delaney's acquisition pace gave him a receptive audience, had seeded enough doubt through informal channels that a confidence motion, if it arrived packaged in a public failure, had a credible chance of passing. His plan required the building's systems to fail visibly during Delaney's opening presentation, and his vendor's access credentials gave him the remote capability to initiate exactly that. As far as he knew, the malicious code was still sitting dormant in the building management system, waiting for the activation command he intended to send from a device registered to an alias. He was not aware that Rhett Calloway had spent the previous 3 hours, with Cassidy's administrative access and Von Mercer's legal oversight, building a mirror architecture that would intercept his activation command, execute it against a simulated environment, and route the authentic behavioral logs directly to a secured recording server with chain of custody documentation attached. Von Mercer arrived at 7 in the morning with the particular focused calm of a lawyer who understood that the value of what they were building depended entirely on how cleanly it was built. He and Rhett had not spoken in 8 months, but resumed the rhythm of their working relationship without ceremony. Rhett outlining the architecture, Von documenting the legal basis for each access point, both of them working quietly while Cassidy cross-referenced the vendor filings. Delaney sat in the corner with her laptop open to the board agenda and found herself watching the apartment rather than her screen. She watched Rhett put his work down twice to answer Lydia's questions. Once about whether hummingbirds were real birds or if they were too small to count, and once about whether a narrator's voice would be different if the narrator was having a bad day. And both times he answered with full attention and without the performative patience that adults sometimes use with children when they want the child to know they are being indulged. He answered because he was interested in the answers. He said that the smallest things sometimes did the most complicated work, which Lydia received with enormous satisfaction. Delaney looked at this exchange and felt something shift in her chest that she did not immediately have language for. She had built her model of the eligible man from a blueprint centered on visible coordinates, professional standing, material proof of ambition, a social circle that reflected status upward. And Preston Tate had satisfied every point on that list and had been so thoroughly empty behind it that she had spent 2 years after their divorce converting the list from a window into a wall. What she was watching across the kitchen table did not fit the list at all. A man in a worn sweater in a rented apartment answering questions about hummingbirds. And yet she could not locate a single thing he was missing that mattered. The board session began at 2 in the afternoon. Garrett took his seat with the controlled ease of a man who had already calculated the outcome and found it satisfactory. Delaney opened the session without obvious tension, presenting the acquisition framework with the measured confidence of someone who had rehearsed every response to every likely objection. At 14 minutes past 2, Garrett activated the remote command from the device in his breast pocket. The building management system received the signal. The simulation architecture received it simultaneously, executed it against the mirror environment, flagged the originating device's identifier, and logged the full command structure to the secured server. The real system did not move. Nothing failed. The screens stayed lit. The elevator indicators remained normal. Garrett's face, when he understood what had not happened, went through a sequence of adjustments that were visible to anyone paying attention. He stood anyway, began the motion he had prepared, and the main display screen, running from Cassidy's laptop at the back of the room, changed from the acquisition presentation to a document viewer showing Garrett's access logs, the vendor filings, the shell company registration, and a clean audio recording of a conversation in which Garrett and the vendor's principal discussed the specific steps required to remove Delaney from her position. The room went very still. Delaney turned to face the board with the deliberate composure of someone who had decided, in the last 48 hours, that she would not raise her voice when she did not need to. She said, "I'd like to request an immediate administrative suspension for Mr. Holloway and the engagement of an independent audit firm by end of business today." The motion passed without dissent. Whitney Boone, whose instinct in any crisis was to find the version of events that redistributed the damage farthest from herself, moved in the 20 minutes following the board session while people were still rearranging their understanding of what had just happened. She positioned herself near two of the institutional board members and introduced a competing narrative that a contract worker with unknown motivations had been granted access to sensitive building systems, that the whole episode raised questions about Delaney's judgment in personnel decisions, and that the individual responsible for producing the damning documentation deserved considerably more scrutiny than the man it had been used against. She was careful, as she always was, to frame accusation as concern. She said she only wanted to raise the question of who Rhett Calloway actually was. Vaughn Mercer answered that question. He had anticipated it would arise, and he had prepared accordingly. He asked for the room's attention, and because he had the quality of stillness that makes people assume authority even before it is demonstrated, he got it. He said that Rhett Calloway had designed the integrated safety architecture protecting 31 major commercial and residential structures across the United States, that the company he had founded with his wife had established the operational standard against which several federal building safety guidelines were subsequently benchmarked, and that his current net asset position, held in a family trust, was sufficient to acquire the real estate portfolio Brooks Meridian had spent 14 months pursuing. He said none of this to elevate Rhett, but to clarify the factual context that Whitney's version of events had required people to ignore. When Delaney looked at Rhett, he was standing near the back with his arms at his sides, and his face carrying the particular calm of someone who has long since stopped needing other people to revise their opinion of him. He had not told her he had been insulted by her in a lobby full of people who would have known, if they had known who he was, that his goodwill toward her building was worth considerably more than her contempt for his jacket. He had fixed the elevator. He had left the warning. He had analyzed the threat. He had built the documentation. He had done every one of these things without once using his actual position as leverage, because his actual position was not how he measured the value of what he did. Rhett addressed the board without notes. He said he had no interest in acquiring Brooks Meridian, in restructuring its leadership, or in any professional outcome from this situation beyond three things: a public disclosure of the building safety vulnerability so that other properties using the same vendor's credentials could audit their own systems, a compensation structure for the facilities workers whose employment records had been used without their knowledge in Garrett's filings, and the formal end of any internal culture that treated the building's maintenance and technical staff as a background element in the company's presentation of itself. He said this was what he would consider a resolution, and he said it without anger. Delaney turned to face the room and said, clearly and without qualifications or preemptive defenses, that she had misjudged Rhett Calloway, that she had said something harmful in front of his child, and that she was sorry. She did not add context. She did not explain the pressure she had been under. She said she was sorry, and she stopped. Rhett said, I accept that, but I want you to understand, being forgiven doesn't mean being trusted. Those are two different things, and one of them takes time. The week that followed the board session moved in the slow procedural rhythm of institutional aftermath: lawyers, auditors, HR reviews, revised vendor registrations, an inbox that required 2 additional staff to process. Delaney managed it all with the practiced efficiency of someone trained by difficulty to compartmentalize. But in the spaces between the managing, she found herself returning to something Cassidy had said quietly on the second day. A question about why, of all the things available to say to a man she had never met, the sentence she had reached for was about marriage. Why that word? Why that framing? Delaney had not answered then. She answered now, in her own head, because the answer had become unavoidable. She had been married once, at 31, to a man named Preston Tate, the right family name, the kind of professional network that opened rooms rather than arriving outside them, every coordinate the conventional measurement of eligible men recommended. Preston had disproved his own credentials efficiently. He had been conducting a parallel arrangement for the final 14 months of their marriage, had viewed her position and income as acquisition targets rather than as characteristics of a woman he had chosen, and had communicated his genuine assessment of her value to his attorney during the divorce in language she had read once, in full, and never reread. What she built after that was not a recovery such as an architecture. No men with complicated histories, no men whose financial position made her own position interesting to them, no men who came with lives already in motion. What she had actually built, she now understood, was a guarantee that she would never again be close to anyone who might need her. She had weaponized her own fear and called it a standard. When she had seen Rhett in that lobby, his jacket, his daughter, his manual labor, she had felt the particular anxiety of her wall being disrespected by proximity, and she had deployed its sharpest edge without stopping to ask what she was actually afraid of. On the third day after the board session, Delaney went to Lydia's school, not to see Rhett. She left a box with Lydia's classroom teacher, a replacement birthday box, from a bakery near the school rather than from the kind of place Delaney would normally send a gift, and a card she had written 3 times before she was satisfied with the simplicity of it. She did not sign it with her title. She signed it with her first name. Lydia read the card to Rhett that evening across the dinner table with the unself-conscious performance of a child who has not yet learned that reading aloud is supposed to be embarrassing. Rhett listened to all of it. He folded the card and put it in the drawer where he kept the things he considered worth keeping, and then he called Lydia back to finish her pasta, and he did not say anything else about the card that night. But later, after Lydia was asleep, he sat with it for a while. He recognized the particular shape of trying in someone who was not practiced at it, because Tessa had told him once that the people who find it hardest to ask for forgiveness are often the ones who believe, somewhere deep in themselves, that they do not deserve to receive it. 3 days after the sentence in the lobby, Delaney went back to Wicker Park in the evening. It was raining, not dramatically, but steadily and practically, the way Chicago rain arrives in early autumn when the weather has decided to stop pretending summer is still possible. She carried a compact umbrella and a white paper box, and she had left her driver in a parking structure 4 blocks away because she had understood, without being told, that arriving in the full apparatus of her professional life was not the right register for what she was trying to do. She rang the buzzer at 2:12 and waited. The intercom made its sound, and then Rhett's voice came through it, careful and even, and she told him who it was. There was a pause, and then the door buzzed open. She climbed the stairs and found him in the hallway outside the apartment rather than behind it, which she understood as a deliberate positioning. She was not being invited in yet. She was being received in a neutral space, and that was fair. He looked at the box, and then at her face, and he waited with the quality of patience that had already begun to feel, to Delaney like its own form of language. She said she had not come because she needed anything from him. She said she had come because she had spent 3 days understanding something she should have understood in 3 minutes, and she wanted him to know she understood it. She said she had looked at him in that lobby and seen everything she had decided to be afraid of, and she had spoken from that fear rather than from anything true. She said she had told herself, for 4 years, that the men she needed to keep at a distance were the ones who looked like him. And she understood now that what she had actually been keeping at a distance was anyone who might cost her something. Rhett did not respond immediately. He looked at her in the way he looked at things when he was assessing rather than performing assessment, and then said he appreciated her saying it. He said he had been trying, since the lobby, to figure out what kind of person she was, and 3 days had given him more information than he expected. He said he had watched her apologize to his daughter without using the apology to make herself feel better, and that this was harder than it sounded, and he had noticed. He said none of this resolved the fact that she had said something that required his daughter to ask him on a city bus whether being different from what other people expected was something to be ashamed of, and that question was one he could not entirely forgive on anyone's behalf, but Lydia's. Delaney said she understood. She said she was not asking to be forgiven all the way, or quickly, or on any schedule that was convenient for her. She said she was asking for the chance to behave differently, not to demonstrate the change but to actually make it. And she understood the distinction was one he would have to observe rather than be told. She had brought the box, she said, because Lydia had mentioned on the day she had been in the apartment that she liked the kind with the raspberry jam in the middle, and Delaney had remembered. From behind Rhett's left hip, at a height that suggested she had been standing just inside the door listening for at least the last 2 exchanges, Lydia said, "Dad, can she eat pizza with us? We have enough." Rhett looked down at his daughter for a long moment, and then he looked at Delaney, and then he said, "1 dinner. No promises beyond that." Delaney said, "That's more than fair." She said it in a voice that had lost most of the architectural precision she normally maintained in it, and it sounded, to her own ears, like something closer to the truth. The pizza place was 4 blocks from the apartment, the kind of neighborhood establishment that did not have a website or a reservation system, and where the person at the counter knew Rhett and Lydia by name and had their usual waiting by the time they arrived. Delaney sat across from them in a booth with a paper placemat that had a cartoon map of Chicago on it, and Lydia spent the first 20 minutes explaining the errors in the cartoon's geography with a precision that Delaney found unexpectedly entertaining. The waitress brought root beer without being asked, extra napkins because Lydia always needed extra napkins, and a small cup of ranch dressing that Lydia dipped everything into, including the breadsticks. Delaney ordered water, and then, when Lydia looked at her root beer with the expression of a child who considers it polite to give guests the opportunity to reconsider their choices, Delaney ordered a root beer, too. When Jolene Harper, the neighbor from across the hall, arrived to walk Lydia home at 7:30, an arrangement Rhett had made during the afternoon, and that Lydia received with the cheerful adaptability of a child who trusted that configurations were being managed thoughtfully. Rhett and Delaney walked out into the street, which had gone cold and clean the way autumn streets do after the weather has finished with them. They walked without particular direction for the better part of an hour, and Delaney did not try to make the conversation sophisticated, and Rhett did not try to make it comfortable in ways that would cost him accuracy. She asked him why he had not gone back, after Tessa, after the company. He said he had spent about 3 months after Tessa died, believing the way to honor what they had built was to rebuild it bigger, to prove to whatever abstract audience exists in the mind of a grieving person that it had not been destroyed. He said Lydia had cured him of this, not by saying something wise, but by being entirely herself in ways that required his complete presence to properly witness. He said the thing worth being, in the time he had, was the person who showed up for the life that was actually happening. Delaney said she had been trying, for the better part of a decade, to build something large enough that no one would question whether she was worth the space she occupied, and that this project had consumed the time she might otherwise have spent learning how to want things actually available to her. She said she did not know whether she was good at the kind of thing she suspected she was moving toward, and she wanted him to know she was aware of that. Rhett said, "You already know how to work hard. The rest of it is just work of a different kind." The evening ended at the corner near his building, with a handshake, not ironic, not provisional, but the kind that marks an agreement between two people who have decided to be honest with each other. He said she had done better than he expected. She said, "Then the next time, I'll try to do better than that." In the months that followed, Brooks Meridian changed in ways that were visible on the organizational chart and in ways that were not. The independent audit confirmed Garrett Holloway's scheme in full, and the resulting legal exposure produced a settlement that Delaney redirected entirely into a compensation fund for the workers whose personal information had been used without consent. Whitney Boone resigned 2 weeks after the board session, having correctly identified that her particular skills were better matched to a company whose leadership found her impulses useful. The facilities team received a formal renegotiation of their vendor contracts, a new escalation process for maintenance requests, so that residents and tenants in Brooks Meridian properties would not wait 6 days for heat in October, and a position at the operations table for a worker representative, the first time the building's technical staff had held a seat in any decision-making process above the scheduling level. Delaney established a scholarship bearing Tessa Calloway's name, funded through the Brooks Meridian Foundation, for the children of skilled tradespeople working in urban construction and building systems. She did not consult Rhett before naming it. She consulted him after, and he sat with the information for a long time before saying it was the right name. He said Tessa would have found it funny that her name was on something that lived inside a world she had spent years trying to fix. Delaney said she thought that was probably part of why it was right. Rhett took an independent advisory role with the building's safety infrastructure, limited in scope, specific in mandate, entirely on his terms. He kept his apartment in Wicker Park. He kept his bus routes. He kept the Tuesday morning ritual of making breakfast with Lydia before school, which involved a standing argument about whether eggs were better scrambled or fried that had been going on for 2 years with no resolution in sight. Delaney came to the school's autumn concert in November and sat 3 rows behind Rhett. She had not been invited to sit with him. She had been invited to the concert, which was a different thing, and she understood the difference. Lydia played the recorder in a group of 12 children, and the performance was precisely as chaotic and sincere as recorder performances by 8-year-olds always are. And Delaney watched Rhett watch his daughter, and understood something that her previous years of measuring people had not equipped her to measure. At the company recognition event in December, Delaney stood at the podium before 300 people and said that 4 months earlier she had looked at a man in her lobby and told him something about his worth that she had arrived at without a single accurate piece of information. She did not repeat the sentence. She said instead that there were people in that room whose competence had been the structural fact underlying her company's safety for years, and that she had been conducting her leadership as though that fact existed somewhere beneath the threshold of acknowledgement, and she was done with that. She looked at Rhett, who was standing near the back wall with Lydia leaning against his arm, and she said, "Some people don't need to tell you they're worth being chosen. The way they live says it for them." The room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when someone has said the thing that was true all along. Rhett looked down at Lydia. Lydia squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The following Sunday, Delaney arrived at the apartment in Wicker Park with a cake she had made herself. The kind with raspberry jam in the middle, because she had looked up the recipe 3 times and attempted it twice, and Lydia took 1 bite and announced with complete candor that the crust was a little bit burned on one side. Delaney laughed, and the laugh was the kind that arrives without permission, the kind that means something has stopped being managed and started being felt. Rhett cut 3 slices anyway. They sat at the small table near the window, with the city lights coming on in the early dark of December, and the woman who had once stood in a marble lobby and told this man that no one would want him was learning, one Sunday at a time, how to want the right things.